guys, it's Emily, and today I'm here to bring you a recent reads video of the last 3 books that I read. So let's just get right into it. The first book I finished recently was When We Were on Fire by Addie Zierman, and the subtitle is A Memoir of Consuming Faith, Tangled Love, and Starting Over. This is Addie's memoir of growing up in the evangelical Christian church of the 1990s outside of Chicago in a suburb, and she was very involved in her youth group, and she even dated a guy in the youth group who was very extreme, and he was going away to be a missionary for a year, and he broke up with her multiple times because he said it was what the Lord wanted him to do, and she became very involved in this evangelical movement, and she went to an evangelical college, and then later on, she started having doubts about the church, and she began to drink heavily, and she had a problem with alcoholism, and she also was married, and is still married to a guy, but she began to run around with a bad crowd, and there was discussion of them getting divorced, and she was just talking about how this evangelical faith sort of messed up her life in a way, and how she eventually came to understand her relationship with God in a new way, and things like that, and now she's in a much better place, both spiritually and, in her life. This was a very interesting book. I heard about this book on Modern Mrs. Darcy a long time ago. This has been on my TBR since January of 2014, so I was quite glad to be done, getting it off my TBR. Unfortunately, I've read several of these memoirs about women who have grown up in the evangelical church, and I always find it sort of hard to relate to them. I was a Methodist, and I still am a Methodist. I attend a Methodist church, and I grew up in this Methodist church, and the Methodists don't have nearly as many of the issues as the evangelical church has. We do have some issues, like currently we're having a big debate in our church about LGBT rights, and there's a threat of the church splitting into multiple denominations, but we have had ordained women ministers since the 1950s, and so, like, for example, Addie talks about how she felt like her ambition was to be a missionary wife, because that was what the church told girls they should strive to be, just missionary wives, not missionaries themselves, but, supporting their husbands in doing God's work. And throughout the book, there's this theme of she thinks that the ultimate way to serve God is to have a baby in a hut, and she, over the course of the book, realizes A, she doesn't want to have a baby in a hut, and B, she doesn't actually want to go out of the country to do her mission work. She wants to stay in America, and so, there's a lot of talk about, like, women feeling second best in the church and feeling like their voices aren't heard, and again, I can relate to that up to a point, because we do have issues with female pastors being paid less in the Methodist church and things like that, and we recently had, you might have seen it in the news, there was a big uproar because the Methodist Church refused to vote on a measure that said that men and women are equal, so that was a huge thing, and there was also a discussion about how calling God she was not good in the Methodist Church. So anywho, this was interesting, but I didn't particularly relate to it a whole lot, but I would recommend this if you're interested in, reading a memoir about somebody who's left the evangelical church. It's very similar to, like, Rachel Held Evans or Sarah Bessey, if you've read either of those memoirs, which I have. I've read both of those memoirs. But yeah, it was a really interesting book, and I got it through Interlibrary Loan, which is why I'm showing you this picture, because the original book I had this huge Interlibrary Loan sticker. But yeah, interesting, but not, like, super amazing or anything like that. I then read A Storied Life by Leigh Kramer. I read this for the BookTubeathon prompt to read a book with green on the cover. As you can see, it's the green book. I read this via my ebook. Leigh is a blogger that I've been following for several years now, and I found her through Modern Mrs. Darcy as well. And she announced a few months ago that her first novel was coming out, and I pre-ordered it on my Kindle, and I was really excited that it finally became available. This is a romance novel about Olivia, who is an art gallery owner, and she finds out that her grandmother has cancer, and she is appointed her grandmother's power of attorney for health care, and so it's about her experiences helping care for Graham while she is in hospice, but she also meets a guy who's a client with her gallery, Rankin, and on the very same day that she finds out that Graham has cancer, and so it's about their relationship as well. This was a very interesting romance novel. I would actually argue that it's not a romance novel per se. The romance isn't like the main point of the book, but it's still a really interesting read. I will say that I felt like the timing in this book was kind of odd. Like at the beginning of the book, Graham talks about she has 6 months left to live, and so you presumably think this book is going to last 6 months, and it does last up until Graham's death, and then for a short period after Graham's death, but I never felt like it was really 6 months. Like even at the very end, Rankin and Olivia's relationship still felt very new to me, and I sort of felt like it wasn't shown very well how much time had passed, and so therefore the relationship didn't feel very fully fleshed out, because again, the romance is not the main focus of the book. It's the Olivia's relationship with her grandmother and Olivia's experiences with hospice. I just think the book explained hospice care very well, and I enjoyed that part, and I learned a lot about hospice. There's a ton of moving parts that go into doing hospice and having caring for someone who's on hospice. So yeah, I enjoyed this. I actually think I'm going to do a more in-depth review on this, because it did make me think a lot about like realism in fiction and how much realism you need to enjoy a book and things like that. So look out for my further review on this book. The third book I finished recently was A Year of Marvellous Ways by Sarah Winman. This I read for the Booktubeathon prompt to read a book with a beautiful spine, and as you can see, the spine is very gorgeous. The book as a whole is very beautiful, and I really like this cover and this whole book design. The book designer is very talented, and I really enjoyed looking at this book. I picked up this book because a user I follow on Litsy, Karen UK, really praised this book in several posts on Litsy, and she and I tend to have similar reading taste, and so I was very interested in picking this up, and I got this for Christmas last year, so I was really glad to pick it up. Unfortunately, I was a little disappointed in this book. I felt like the writing was very beautiful and very lyrical, and there was very beautiful imagery, but I felt like the focus was more on like the aesthetic than the actual plot of the book, and so that disappointed me. I guess I was expecting more of a linear structure to this book. But this book follows a 90-year-old woman named Marvellous Ways, and she lives in Cornwall near a creek that's like pretty much abandoned by everybody else, and she lives in this like old gypsy caravan, and there's also a church that is right across from her van, and this was the area where she grew up, and so her parents are buried in the churchyard, and so it's all about her experiences there. And then eventually a young man named Francis Drake comes along. He's a soldier. This takes place in 1947, and he's a soldier who's just come back from France, and he's experienced great loss in his life, and it's about their relationship and how they begin to form sort of like a makeshift family unit together. And then there's also another woman named Peace who arrives in the town that's near this creek, and it's about the three of them developing their own kind of love. And we also see Marvellous's backstory and Drake's backstory, and it was an interesting book, but again, I felt like it was more focused on like beautiful writing versus the actual plot, and there was a lot of like loose ends at the ending, which I really hate. I don't like loose endings. I want my book all neatly tied up, but this was, a very different kind of read for me. Sarah Wyndham has been on BookTube recently for her newest book, 10 Man. I know Julie over at A Girl in a Book really raved about this, the 10 Man, and so I think, a lot of people really like Sarah Wyndham and I think I would be willing to try 10 Men or her other book, When God Was a Rabbit. But this one, it was okay, but it didn't meet my expectations, and I can only recommend it if you have a particular taste in lyrical writing, or if you're interested in like seeing a lot of flashbacks, and that isn't in a linear structure. And also, this has like a magical realism component to it, but it never like comes out and tells you for sure whether it's a magical thing or if it's really like Marvellous's memories and like it's all in her head. So again, I'm not sure if it's really a magical realism book. This was okay, a very interesting book, but I was a little disappointed in it. I also wanted to mention very briefly that I read this one for the BookTubeathon prompt to flip a coin and allow it to pick your first read. And actually, I think that I technically didn't do it right because I didn't read this book first. But I did read this book before I read the other book that I picked from, which was Jane Austen at Home, which I'm in the middle of right now. So in that way, I did meet the prompt. So yeah, this was for that prompt. So that's all I've read recently. And I'm in the middle of 3 more books right now, and I'm looking to September and getting some new books. I already got my September TBR picked out, and I've got all the books from the library, so I'm really excited. So I hope everybody's having a great day and reading some great books, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye!